Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Steve Leibowitz. As weekly protests reached a 30th week, continuing unabated after the first piece of the coalition judicial reform was passed, and the protesters are predicting catastrophe to the Israeli democracy and to the very unity of the nation. Some have gone so far as to suggest that the splitting of the nation in two could be a real option. Prime Minister Netanyahu told the American media, not the Hebrew media who report to us, the folks that live here, that the measures were reasoned and necessary, and the protests are sincere but silly. Well, joining us this evening are two of the nation's brightest and most insightful commentators. Ari Harrow was Prime Minister Netanyahu's chief of staff for years. He was the man closest to the Israeli leader. And Yossi Klein Halevi is a philosophy, author, visionary, legendary Jewish activist. You won't find that in Wikipedia. It's my personal description, having known the man since our teens. Yossi, after that kind of an intro, let me start with you. Could you try to equate the current disputes and divisions in our country to some time or event in Israeli or Jewish history?
Steve, first of all, it's good to be with you and with you, Ari. This moment is bringing me back to the summer of 1982, which is when I made Aliyah and became an Israeli. The summer of 1982 was one of the most divisive times in Israel's history. The IDF had invaded Lebanon to expel the terrorist PLO infrastructure from the south, to stop the Katyusha attacks on the cities. But then, under the instructions of Defense Minister Sharon, kept going toward Beirut, lay siege to Beirut. Israeli society had never been divided before over war. War always brought us together. And now war was tearing us apart. So my frame of reference, the Israel that I joined, was a dysfunctional society. And over the years, one of the deepest satisfactions that I felt as an Israeli was watching our society heal. The schisms remain, deep schisms along multiple fault lines, cultural, religious, ethnic, political, of course. But we managed to pull together, certainly in times of war. And now I feel that if anything, this moment is worse, much worse. Because in retrospect, Lebanon divided us over a policy issue. Today, we are divided profoundly over our basic understanding of what it means to be an Israeli. What do we mean by a Jewish and democratic state? What is a Jewish state? What is a democratic state? And suddenly you have two profoundly different, antithetical ideas of what this country is supposed to be.
Ari, you know, it all really comes down to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's the man in charge. And we get some mixed signals from him sometimes. On the one hand, he's talking consistently about compromise, finding a way to reach agreement with the opposition. On the other hand, just last week, we saw him basically caving in to Justice Minister Levine and Ben Gvir and not making a last-minute deal that seemed to be on the table, possible to reach. What do you think are the next moves of the Prime Minister? It's an important junction.
Well, firstly, Steve, thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here. And Yossi, it's great to see you as well. I think that there's two important points to keep in mind when looking at this situation. Number one is the political reality that Netanyahu is dealing with. If you look at Netanyahu from his first term in office until the formation of this current government, he is always most comfortable politically being at the center of his coalition. He has people to his right, he has people to his left, and that allows him to pivot between the two more moderate stances and leave the extremists out on the side. This is the first time in office where he is very far to one side, and he doesn't have anyone to his left that he can lean on. And as such, he's in a political predicament.
Everyone else in his coalition is further to the right than him, you're saying?
I'm saying definitely from a party perspective, there are individuals within his party, and we can talk about that afterwards, who may be starting to pull in a different direction. But ultimately, the most comfortable position for any leader, truth be told, is to be in the middle where he can pivot one way or the other. And what we saw last week with the reasonableness vote was a situation where he did not have that, let's call it, left pivot, and therefore he was politically handcuffed to move things forward. I think the second thing to note specifically on this matter was the let's call it at that point the threats of the reservists to stop their service in the military. And for all intents and purposes, and I heard this from people with deep knowledge of the situation, there were individuals who were much more flexible in their stance and really wanted to reach an agreement. But the second it became a threat that the military was holding over the head of the government, it really left many of these people, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, not much choice.
Well, maybe we'll come back to that, but I got a sense at some points that it was actually members of the coalition that kept harping on the fact that it's the reservists, it's dangerous, and they kept going back to the issue of the reservists more than the protesters themselves, emphasizing their availability.
I think that, something that to me, at least, is lost on the general public is there are significant and serious concerns that the protesters have, and I think that they're rational and they're reasonable and they're ideas that have to be taken into consideration. There is another side, and the other side is not Smotrich and not Ben Gvir and not Yariv Levin. There's people out there, average Israelis that serve in the military, that are pilots and infantry soldiers and doctors and lawyers, that have different views. And what's really lacking is some type of dialogue that allows that side to express its own concerns with the current situation and would allow the country to try and heal the rifts.
All right, we'll continue with that, I'm sure. Yossi, if Benjamin Netanyahu...
Will I get a chance to respond?
You can respond, but let me...
comments?
Let me just add in this comment, though. If Netanyahu was to put the entire judicial reform plan on the shelf and was willing to form a national unity government or a national survival government, call it whatever you want, with Ben Gvir and Smotrich out and Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz in, should they do it to save the nation?
Notice the long pause. And the long pause is a heavy heart, because I believe that the problem is not only Ben Gvir and Smotrich. They're the most obvious problem. The problem is Netanyahu himself, who has corrupted the political system. I don't know if Netanyahu is guilty of the legal charges of corruption that he's dealing with, but I certainly know how Jewish history is going to judge him as the man who fundamentally corrupted the Israeli ethos and the political system. And he did that in several ways. First of all, by taking the far right from the fringes of Israeli politics and bringing them into the heart of Israeli governance, into the heart of the security system. I have to wake up every morning and pinch myself and say, Ben Gvir and the Hilltop Youth, the most extreme elements of Israeli society, are in control of the Israeli police. And then I remind myself of the surreal Israel that Netanyahu has given us. He also corrupted Israeli politics by turning the Likud from a mainstream, normative, essential, conservative party to a populist, anti-democratic party. The younger MKs who are coming up in the party, who are all Netanyahu loyalists, whom he installed, are politicians who would be just as comfortable sitting in Ben Gvir's Jewish Power Party as they are in the Likud. Benny Begin, Menachem Begin's son, spoke the other day at one of the rallies, and he said this Likud is unrecognizable to anyone who knew his father's Likud. And so, for me to make peace with Netanyahu it gnaws at me. It gnaws at everything that I feel needs to be upheld about the basic decency of this society.
You didn't say no.
I didn't say no because it depends on the circumstances. If we're looking at the possibility of a deal with the Saudis, then we have to consider that. But the reason that I'm also not saying yes is that the problem is not only Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. The problem is the Likud itself. The problem are the extremists, the hardcore ideologues, Levin and others in the party, who Netanyahu is beholden to. Netanyahu can't free himself from their grip. So I look at the arithmetic, the political arithmetic here, and I don't see how, even assuming Netanyahu would want to move into the center, and I'll take Ari's word for it that that's where he wants to be, he doesn't have the possibility. Netanyahu, who is we always called him the Kosen, the magician of Israeli politics. Well, Netanyahu has outsmarted himself. He's boxed himself into a corner, and I don't see any way for him to retrieve himself from that self-imposed prison and to restore something, salvage something of the legacy that he has destroyed, his own legacy that he's destroyed in the last year.
All right, Ari, I just wanted to actually, the Prime Minister has given several interviews in recent days, not to the Hebrew press, but to the English press, a lot easier for us to listen to and hear. And I'd like you to comment on a few of the things the Prime Minister said, so let's give a listen.
Well, look, we'll go into uncharted territory, and I really would like to believe that they won't do that. And the reason is that, first of all, we're all subject to the rule of law. The Prime Minister is subject to the rule of law. The Knesset, our parliament, is subject to the rule of law. The judges are subject to the law. Everybody is subject to the law. Now, the closest thing we have to a constitution are basic laws. That's what we're dealing with. And what you're talking about is a situation, a potential situation, where in American terms, the United States Supreme Court would take a constitutional amendment and say that it's unconstitutional. We have the most activist judicial court on the planet, and it's arrogated for itself powers from the government, from the executive, and the legislative branches. So we're trying to correct it, but I want to bring the pendulum to the middle. I don't want to bring the pendulum to the other side. There's a middle ground there, and I hope we can achieve it.
Ari, so maybe you can enlighten us as to why all of the Prime Minister's interviews are in English and not Hebrew in these days. But more importantly, Netanyahu will not say that he will accept the Bagatz if it passes, if it throws out the reasonableness law. Do you think that's the case, that he might reject it? And then where are we at?
It's a lot to answer, and I'd also like to touch on some of what Yossi had to say as well. But so let me start off with the media. So I think that there's two things for us to keep in mind here. Number one is a strategic approach to media, which is not new to the current situation. Back in I think it was around 2014, there was a running clock on one of the Israeli media sites as to how long Netanyahu has gone between interviews to the Hebrew press. This is a strategy that he uses regularly. He stays away from the Israeli press during his time in office, and around election time, he becomes very much available. I don't think that there's much of a change when it comes to that. The second issue here is that, at least to officially, he is prohibited from taking an active role in this debate by the Attorney General in Israel. And although he obviously, because of his position, is not, is not completely at arm's length, there is a difference between speaking to the international community, where it affects international investment, international relations, etc., responsibilities that are squarely on his plate as prime minister, versus jumping into the domestic debate, which the Attorney General has prohibited him from doing. As far as your question with regard to the Supreme Court ruling on reasonableness, I believe, and I hope that I'm right, that whatever decision is brought down, it will be accepted. I know that some of the comments that are running around out there definitely raise questions about that. I think that, this is my own personal view, it would be potentially catastrophic if we run into that type of constitutional dilemma.
Full-blown constitutional crisis.
Correct.
The government saying they accept or don't accept the Bagatz, the rest of the nation, the police included, saying we do accept the Bagatz, and then where are we at?
Correct. And I don't see Netanyahu doing that. I think that ultimately he is a Democrat, and he is someone who has tremendous respect for the rule of law, and I don't see him going ahead with that. Now, if it's okay, just one comment to what Yossi had to say. I won't talk about some of the opinions you shared, and I understand where they come from, but I think that it is important for us to recall one other piece of the way things have played out over the last, half a dozen years. And that is the complete boycott of, let's call it the left, in joining a Netanyahu government. And as you see, he ultimately has been forced into a situation where these are the only available partners. And one last point is that whether you support Netanyahu or don't support Netanyahu, it's not just, quote unquote, Netanyahu or just some of the people in the Likud, the new Knesset members. There are 64 seats, which represents, a tremendous number of Israelis from all walks of life, from all parts of the country, with varying views. And they knew what they were voting for. And again, I think that the boycott sort of forced people to take sides, whereas if any type of unity was brought to the table, I think the majority would support that type of unity, and that would allow, for us as a nation and for individuals to start to mend some of the wounds that are out there.
Before we run out of time, I've got to ask you both about the ideology.
I have to, Steve, I have to respond.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go.
There was no complete boycott of the Netanyahu government. Benny Gantz joined a previous Netanyahu government, and Netanyahu did what he does, which is betray Gantz and essentially force him out. As far as the 64 seats and the majority of Israelis knowing what they voted for, there have been polls recently that asked a very simple question. Did you know about the judicial revolution that the government intended? A majority, not only of general voters, a strong majority of general voters, but a majority of Likud voters didn't know for a very simple reason. Netanyahu concealed his agenda from the public. He did not make judicial transformation part of his platform when he was running. The far right did, Netanyahu didn't. So, please, Steve.
No, I just, we're almost running out of time. There were so many issues I wanted to get to and wasn't able. But I have to ask you guys this. There's so much talk in recent weeks about Israel splitting into two, with a nation of Israel with a capital in Tel Aviv and a nation of Judea with a capital in Judea, in Jerusalem and with all of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria settlements in the Judea side. Yossi, is this going to happen in our lifetime? Are we going to split into two countries?
Listen, if God forbid we do, then two countries means no country. And we know that from Jewish history. But, you know, if I can answer you personally, Steve, I would have, in the past, at any point until this last half year, I would have said to you that both of these camps are warring within me, within my being, and that there's a part of me that understands each of these camps. And I want to go back to being able to listen to the other side that Ari is talking about, because there are wonderful people in the Netanyahu camp. But at this moment, where I'm at is I feel that I am struggling to literally save this country, startup nation, Israel as a modern, successful country, from a dual assault of zealotry and corruption, which is represented by this.
All right, I just have to let Ari have a chance before we run out of time. Ari, are you part of Israel or Judea, or are we one nation forever?
We are one nation forever. I believe that struggle that's going on within Yossi is still there.
Is it in you too?
It is. It's in me, and I actually believe it's in most people. If you look at the polling from the beginning of this judicial reform until today, you will find that the majority of voters in Israel want some judicial reform, but they want it done in a way of compromise.
And we're mostly in the center, aren't we?
We're mostly in the center. And if you take this issue off the table just for 1 second, I don't remember in my lifetime here in Israel a time where there's more unity and more shared opinion and outlook when it comes to security, when it comes to the security challenges, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to international relations and the need or the desire to reach peace outside of Israel. The economy, Yossi mentioned Startup Nation. I think that the vast majority of issues, there is tremendous unity within Israel around them, and we just need to find our way through this.
I'm sorry we're out of time. At least we had that positive note. I did hear some positive things from Yossi as well, more than I was expected from both of you, I must say, but that's because you're both such amazing guys. Well, that's all the time we have this evening. Thank you to our guests, Yossi Klein-Halevi and Ari Harrow, and thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Leibowitz. This was ILTV's Insider. Please tune in next week for more Everything Israel. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at iltv.tv. Thanks for watching, and shalom from Israel.